The Golden Lute by Harrison Lee. I could hear John Philippe calling out my name. I would be there soon, but if there's one thing that my grandfather taught me, it was that I should always start what I finish. I had started planting my crops for the summer, so I was going to finish this last row of seeding. My grandfather could wait 5 more minutes. I walked through the opening in our small hut to the bed of my slowly decaying grandfather. "Jean Philippe," I said, "what do you need?" "Listen close to me, Maurice," he replied. "This is important to me." I came a little bit closer. I didn't know what to expect. In our small, boring village life, anything that strayed from the normal was unexpected. When I was your age, I spent all of my free time in the woods. My favorite place to be was a gigantic yew tree behind my family's hut. One day I decided to chop down one of the large branches of the tree and make a lute, for I loved music. It took me an entire year to make this lute, but when I finished, my hard work was paid off. This lute produced the most beautiful sound that I had ever heard. When I played my lute, people began to gather around me to hear its wonderful sound. The townsfolk told me that when I played, the lute shone with a golden glow. The lute had brought me fame and good fortune to my family. Jean-Philippe paused for a moment to catch his breath and take a sip of water. I waited patiently for him to continue. It seemed as if the best days of my life were ahead of me, but it was not to be. King Louis XI, the Cunning, heard of the Golden Lute's fame and wanted to have it for his own. He sent his men to my hut in the dead of night, turned everything over to find the lute, and they took it with them back to the castle. "That is a sad story, to be sure, but why do you tell me this now?" I asked. "I am a dying man, as is the king, and I cannot bear to die knowing that Snake has his hands on my hard work. If at all possible, I would like to play the lute one last time. I want you to retrieve it and bring it back to its family glory." I was appalled. Only moments ago I was noting how boring my routine life had become, and now I was being asked by my ailing grandfather to break into the castle to pry his lute from the king's hands. What was there to say? "Jean-Philippe, grandfather, you have raised me from a small child into the man I am now, and you have taught me a great deal about how I should live my life. In fact, I owe everything to you for taking care of me. You say that your most beloved possession has been taken from you, and I have no reason to doubt you. You're asking me to do something that only a fool will think to do, to risk my life and take back what is rightfully yours. Although every bone in my body tells me this is a bad idea, I find it hard to deny the wishes of an ailing man. I will get your lute." By this time my grandfather had fallen asleep, but I would keep my promise to him anyway. I would find his lute, but where to start? I set out for town. My gut feeling told me there was someone who would know the answers to my questions. "Maurice, what brings you to town today?" "I am in dire need for answers, Francois. You are the man who can help me." I peered around this strange man's mess of a cave. Francois was the wisest man I knew. He had been alive before my grandfather was even born. He was the only resource I could turn to. "It depends. What is it that you are so desperate to know?" "My grandfather once made a lute, one that he claims to produce some of the most beautiful music in the world. The king took it a long while ago. You wouldn't happen to know what he has done with it, would you?" Francois looked at me gravely. "I might, or I might not. It all really depends." He trailed off, looking at me strangely. I hoped that I hadn't gone too far too fast. Francois nodded towards my pocket, and I reached out and pulled out some coins. He snatched them out of my hand and quickly stashed them away. "Yes, I do think I know where your grandfather's lute is." I sat down and listened very closely to what he had to say. He told me the king had indeed stolen my grandfather's lute and took it with him to the castle. He told me that at the moment the lute could be found on the mantel above the fireplace in the king's dining hall. How would one reach this dining hall you speak of?" I interrogated. Francois looked at me questioningly. "Well, I suppose if some very, very foolish person set his mind to taking the lute back," I shifted in my seat, "he would have to make it across the castle moat. Then, somehow, he would need to scale the castle wall, make it all the way around the castle hallways without being noticed by the guards, then go up the main staircase, take a left, then a right, and then another left, and finally make it to the dining hall. Then he would have to locate the lute, bag it, and then make it all the way back out of the castle without getting lost or killed. It's simple as that." I jumped up. "Thank you, Francois." "Wait, Here, take this, just in case, of course. He handed me an 8-inch knife. I took it reluctantly and ran out of the hut. Don't do anything you will later regret, Francois yelled after me. I ran home to prepare for my escapade. I needed to draw up my routes to and from the castle, as well as gather the necessary tools for my job. It was going to be a bumpy night. Getting over to the castle was the easy part. Making it across was my first test. Francois had not described to me how wide this moat was. It was less of a hop over a creek and more like a leap of faith. I had to think on my feet. I ran to the woods that weren't far away and picked out a tall and skinny tree. Using the knife Francois had given me, I cut it down to a usable size. I was going to have to pole vault across. I am no athlete, but I realized there really weren't a lot of alternatives. On my tight schedule, improvisation was paramount. I braced myself mentally, going through the motions that I assumed I had to go through to make it across. I took a few steps back and ran. I didn't know how to time my jump, so I just waited until the last possible second before I planted the tree trunk into the ground. Luckily, I made it across, though I know not how. When I threw the tree aside, I hadn't got to work climbing the walls. The king prided himself on his lavish lifestyle, but his castle walls told a different story. Vines crept all over it, giving me some needed hand and footholds. Climbing the wall was tough, but it would turn out to be the least of my troubles. I made it over the wall safely, so now I focused my attention to avoiding the guards on my way to the dining hall. I kept to the shadows as I made my way through the snaking hallways, making sure I never lost concentration. I couldn't afford to stray off path. As I was nearing my turn, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly hid behind a sculpture as two guards walked by. As they strolled past my hiding place, I noticed all the art adorning the walls, paintings, sculptures, and even some exotic rugs. Louis XI didn't waste any space. I wondered if he had stolen all his decorations from defenseless people like he had with my grandfather. The guards passed, and I continued on my way. I found the staircase easily, and climbed it as quickly and as silently as possible. I reached the top, and there it was, the dining hall, my destination. I tiptoed in and looked around. Suddenly I noticed the fireplace on the far wall with a mantel above it. My heart beating rapidly with anticipation. I made it over without making a sound, and began to look for the lute. Checked all up and down the mantel, feeling for the lute in the dark. Did my senses deceive me? The lute was not to be found. I started to become anxious. I swept over the mantel once more, and then again. I was not dreaming. The lute was not in the dining hall. I sat down in one of the king's luxurious dinner chairs, and put my head in my hands. I had come all this way to be fooled by a crazy old man. I just couldn't bear the sight of my grandfather's disappointing face when he saw me come home empty-handed. Suddenly, I heard a soft, beautiful sound echoing down the hallway. I stood up, ears pricked, and followed the sound to its source. My feet padded along the hallway as soon as the sound became louder and clearer. I closed my eyes and was transfixed by the pure beauty of the music. I nearly lost all concentration. Luckily, my determination held strong. I came upon the room from which the music was coming from. I slowed my heartbeat and bit back on my bated breath. I peered around the corner. King Louis XI held John Philippe's lute in his arms, and was stroking it affectionately. He did not seem to be playing it with any dexterity, but as his hands passed over the strings, euphoria poured from the instrument. I took a step back and sat down against the wall. I needed to focus on the task at hand. This was not going to be as easy as I thought. I decided to wait it out, to wait for the king to get a little sleepy first. Then I would go into action. I waited an eternity. The king tortured me with pure bliss, and I was getting impatient. I was contemplating just taking the lute from his hands, but that would be foolish. Finally, the music stopped, and I heard snoring. I stood up and stepped into the door boldly. The king lay there asleep, but in his hands rested the lute. I racked my brains for an alternative, but I could find none. I would need to pry the lute from the King of France's hold. I set about my meticulous work. First I lifted a finger, then I stopped as the king became restless. Then I waited for my heart to stop racing before I lifted more fingers. The left hand was clear, and then his arm. I carefully bent the left elbow to set it aside, out of the way. I got started on the right arm. The king was holding the lute firmly in his right hand, so lifting each finger was more tasking than before. Beads of sweat appeared on my forehead as my impatience mixed with my anxiety. The fingers were free. Now I needed to lift the right arm off the lute, and I would be home to my grandfather, home free. My sweaty hand slipped, dropping the king's arm on the bed. His eyes shot wide open, looking at me. We stared at each other for a moment, neither of us knowing what to do. My pure fear was reflected in his eyes. Then he opened his mouth and let out an inhuman shriek, a scream that reverberated throughout the castle. I closed my eyes and clenched my teeth. This couldn't be happening. I had to ask fast, or be dead. I grabbed Francois's knife from its sheath in my waist and stabbed. I stabbed at his heart and then his lungs, and finally slit his throat, silencing him forever. I had no time to be horrified at what I had done. I grabbed the lute with my blood-soaked hands and ran. I started down the main hall, but stopped when I heard anguished voices coming quickly. I noticed a large window that led up to the roof, which dropped into the courtyard. My new plan of escape was being improvised every second. I jumped out of the window and onto the roof. I ran across it as the guards happened upon the king's slaughtered body. The alarm had officially been sounded. I was a haunted man. I reached the edge of the roof and started to climb down. The guards spotted me quickly. However, in panic, I jumped down into the courtyard. A sharp pain shot up my leg, but I pushed aside and headed for the castle walls. There was no time for distractions. If pain could wait, then maybe death would follow suit. I hobbled over to the wall and began to climb upwards. As I neared the top, guards were swarming underneath me, some climbing up after me, some getting reinforcements. I scurried over and down the wall into the town streets below. I started to limp as fast as I could in the general direction of my hut. I heard footsteps from either side of me. Limping just wouldn't do. I broke out into a run, and so did they. I nearly found myself cornered at several times, and had to make sharp, painful turns to make it out alive. It was going to hurt like hell, but I was determined to survive. I rested behind a barrel for a while to catch my breath. The good news was that the guards ran past without noticing. The bad news was that 100 of them had ran past. My heart sunk, but I would not let my... I may have taken the longer route, but it was the safer route. I didn't see a single guard on my way. The distance did, however, take a toll on me physically and emotionally, and soon I became tired. I dragged myself to sit beneath a tree and closed my eyes. My heart was racing, and my breath was short. I was in pure misery. I was helpless to the pain. I couldn't take much more. I took out my grandfather's lute and looked at it. There was nothing special about it, really. It appeared as a normal lute, very well carved and polished, but normal all the same. I wondered what made it so great. I didn't know how to play one, but it wouldn't hurt to try. I passed my fingers over the strings. The sound that came from it was unreal. It was music beyond the human realm. I craved for more. I played the strings more fervently, the volume of the music growing louder and louder, the ecstasy climbing higher and higher. My eyes were closed, and a smile had crept its way onto my face. Among all this disaster, there was peace. There was harmony. I played the lute with great enthusiasm, and it began to glow. I did not care that there were footsteps coming at me from all directions. The music drowned that all out. I did not mind when my body was yanked out from under the tree. I was in a purely blissful state. The beauty of the music melted away the pain of the swords thrashing at my throat. Blood poured from 1,000 wounds, but the music, it was heavenly. My mind and soul drifted away as my body was cleaved in pieces. They drifted together to my grandfather's hut, where they comforted him as he took his final breaths. They left behind the empty shell, as it was hacked and mutilated by 1,000,000 men. They drifted upwards to ecstasy. What beauty, what powerful beauty.